For over 650 years, the medieval clock of Salisbury Cathedral has methodically been ticking away time and history. But why is it here, and what is its story? Well, from the earliest days of the cathedral, the daily routine of the priests was one of reflection and prayer, as defined by the Psalm Rite and Bible. Psalm 119 states that praise should be said at least 7 times during the day and once at midnight. This division of a day into 8 times of prayer is called the canonical hours, and the priests needed some way to alert them to when the next time of prayer was. Hence they needed some form of timepiece. Originally they might have used sundials, but this had the problem that when the sun disappeared, as in overnight or due to cloud cover, they couldn't tell what the time was. They might have used water clocks, but this had the problem that when the water froze in the winter, again they couldn't tell what the time was. They might have used candles or incense burners, anything that could have been used to show time predictably. As knowledge and experience increased, they came up with mechanical clocks. In this example that we have here, a weight is controlled by gearing so that the weight falls at a predictable rate. The clock is more fully described as a turret clock with verge and foliot escapement. Now what that means is that it is a clock because it is designed to alert the hour by ringing a bell. The word clock comes from the French word cloche, which means bell. It's a turret clock because it was designed to live in the bell tower that was on the north lawn of the cathedral close. The escapement is used to control the rate of fall of the weight, hence providing some predictable measurement of time. Now the cathedral records aren't complete for the early part of the cathedral, but what there is shows that there was a clock within the cathedral close from as early as 1306, and this clock probably from 1386. Bishop Urgem was in control of the cathedral, and he invited 3 Dutch clockmakers to visit him whilst they were touring the country with the permission of the king. It's likely that he would have known these 3 clockmakers from his time in Holland, and whilst they were here, it is likely that they produced the clock that we have today. Between 1386 and 1790, the clock will have resided in the bell tower that was on the north lawn, and when the bell tower was knocked down in 1790, the clock was transferred to the base of the tower and the spire within the cathedral, where it continued to operate until 1884, when the Wiltshire Army Regiment donated a new clock and 4 quarter bells to the cathedral. The medieval clock was literally just pushed to one side, where it was allowed to collect dust. In 1928, an horologist called Mr. T. Robinson applied to the cathedral for permission to go up into the roof space and inspect the mechanism of the new clock. And whilst he was there, he saw the medieval clock sitting to one side, and he immediately recognised this as an early form of clock, and hence the significance of it. So he invited his colleague, Mr. Halgrave Graham, to visit the cathedral and give his second opinion. And on doing so, Mr. Halgrave Graham confirmed indeed this was an early form of clock. In 1929, Mr. Halgrave Graham was invited to write an article for the Horological Press, and during this article he described this as the earliest clock in England, and he gave it a date of being created in or before 1386. In 1931, the clock was lowered from the roof space. It was cleaned by the local clockmaker Sidney Silverthorne, and it was installed in the north transept as an exhibition piece, although it wasn't at that time working. In 1956, Mr. Halgrave Graham was invited back to the cathedral to give a lecture on the clock, and during this lecture he raised the comment, wouldn't it be nice if the clock was back in working form? Well, this was a challenge that the Friends of the Salisbury Cathedral couldn't resist, and they provided the funds to have this restored. They commissioned Mr. John Smith and Sons from Durham to collect the clock and take it back to have it restored. They used the X-ray machines of Rolls-Royce to fully inspect the structure of the clock, and they identified it was originally set up with a verge and foliot escapement, but at some point, probably about the 1700s, it had been converted over to use a pendulum. Although the clock never had a clock face, they also saw that at some point an indicator had been put onto the clock just to show to somebody local to the clock what the time was. They could also see that animated jacks had been put onto the clock, and the jacks of this clock would have told the story of the wise men visiting the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus. So John Smith and Sons restored the clock back to using a verge and foliot escapement and returned it to the cathedral, where it was installed in the north nave aisle, where it currently is. The clock itself was connected to the bishop's bell, which is up at the triforium level of the cathedral, a bell that was cast in 1854 by C and G Mears of London. On the 18th of July 1956, Mr. Halgrave Graham was invited back to the cathedral to set the medieval clock in motion once again. But this isn't the end of the story. In 1958, between March and October, there were lots of letters published in the horological press challenging and discussing the age or the proposed age of this clock. The editor of the press had to bring the discussion to an end because the letters were getting more and more heated. But this wasn't the end of the discussion, and it continued all the way up until 1993. And in 1993, they decided to put the clock on trial. To mark the 40th anniversary of the Antiquarian Clock Society and the 20th anniversary of the Turret Clock Group, the clock was put on trial in the medieval hall which is within the cathedral close. A prosecution was set up, a defence was set up, and on the 1st of May, each side had to submit their evidence to support their case. Fortunately for us, at the end of the case, when the members were invited to vote, 24 voted against the clock, but a higher number of 51 voted for the clock. So since then, we've been able to say that as far as we know, this is the oldest working mechanical clock in the country, and again, as far as we know, the oldest working mechanical clock in the world, unless further evidence comes up to support or dispute that.